Hello BookTube. In my previous video, I talked about the Three Musketeers, and I'll leave a link in the description down below if you missed that. But today I'm going to talk about the first sequel, which is 20 Years After by Alexandre Dumas. So in the previous video, I talked about my history with the Three Musketeers books, how I had read the original Three Musketeers when I was in 6th grade, and could not track down the sequels at that time, and didn't manage to track down the sequels until I was in my mid-30s and living in Cambodia, at which point I got them off of Project Gutenberg. Initially, I tried to jump right into 20 Years After because I thought, well, I already read the Three Musketeers back when I was younger. I vaguely remember some of the story, and I thought, you know, the sequel takes place 20 years after. And it's been about 20 years since I read the original, so maybe that's appropriate. But I got a few chapters in to 20 Years After, and there are all these references back to plot points and characters from the original Three Musketeers that I didn't remember. You know, even they were doing callbacks to even minor things. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to go back and read the original Three Musketeers first before continuing on to 20 Years After. So that's just, I don't know, a little bit of a warning or advisory note. 20 Years After takes place 20 years after the original Three Musketeers, but it's best read immediately after you finish the Three Musketeers. And in fact, it was published, or rather serialized, just 1 year after the original Three Musketeers was serialized. In my opinion, 20 Years After is not quite as gripping as the original Three Musketeers. The original Three Musketeers starts off with a bang. Like we immediately start off with a fight, and then the rest of the plot just goes at a fast pace from there, so that the reader never has a chance to get bored. 20 Years After is in a lot of ways a more interesting book. It's got a more complex plot, but it also moves at a slower pace and requires a bit more patience. So we start off with a bit of a more complicated political situation than we left off with. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But there's a fair amount of exposition about this new complicated political situation. Then we get introduced to the Musketeers. And it turns out of the Three Musketeers, or rather four Musketeers, because there are actually four, D'Artagnan is the only one who stayed on in the service. The other three have new lives and they're all over. So it's a little bit of a where are they now, kind of round up the old gang type plot, which takes a good 200 pages before we actually assemble all the Musketeers and we are ready for the adventure. So yeah, these are big books. So you finish 200 pages and you're still relatively at the beginning of the book, but it's that kind of book. Now, once we do get all the pieces on the chessboard and all the players are established, then the plot kicks into gear after that, and then we get a lot of intrigues and escapes and battles, and then it's a lot of fun. Now, in the third book, the pacing is going to slow down even more, but we're not going to talk about the third book today. We'll talk about the third book another time. So, yeah, 20 Years After. The plot of the book. So, in the first book, the big bad guy who was pulling all the strings was Cardinal Richelieu. I think it's pronounced Richelieu, who was, based on a real historical figure, like a lot of the characters in the Three Musketeers books. When 20 Years After starts off, Richelieu is no longer on the scene, and we have Cardinal, what's his name? Mazarin. Yes, Cardinal Mazarin. And the narrator of the books explicitly tells us that Cardinal Mazarin is not the equal of Cardinal Richelieu. Although there are definitely some similarities. Cardinal Mazarin is a schemer, just like Richelieu is a schemer. But Cardinal Richelieu was able to dominate and control all the factions of French society. Cardinal Mazarin is not able to pull off this same trick, so he's got factions conspiring against them. And in particular, the book sets out another churchman as his adversary. This is Coadjutor Gandhi. Coadjutor is the position, Gandhi is the guy's name. And he is also in the church, but this is the age of history where there was a lot of political scheming in the church. So he is trying to topple Cardinal Mazarin, and they're two kind of equal conspirators, scheming churchmen up against each other, which to a certain extent, to a large extent, makes the plot of this more interesting, especially because neither one here is the clear good guy, so or the clear bad guy, depending on how you look at it. So in the first Three Musketeers book, again, the good and the bad was a little bit more clear cut. Here things are getting a little bit more interesting, and I particularly like the scene. Coadjutor Gandhi is at court. He gets snubbed by Cardinal Mazarin, and then he walks out in a huff, planning his revenge. And D'Artagnan, who is there, turns to Porthos and says, "The devil, that's getting bad. I do not like quarrels between churchmen." And it's kind of like this, it's about to get real type moment here. And sure enough, this is the prelude to the big political schism opening up. So there's some sort of conflict going on here in France between different factions of the aristocracy. It's called the Fronde, and I really don't know a lot about this. I guess this big conflict when the aristocracy was trying to assert itself and at odds with each other is one of the events that influenced young Louis XIV, who I guess it made him think he had to be a really strong king to assert the power of the monarchy. But in terms of what's really going on here, I don't know the history of it. We do get some interesting stuff in here, though. There is, at one point, the plot gets dominated by an escape plan for Duke, what was his name? Sorry, 1 minute here, looking at my notes. Duke de Beaufort. Sorry. Yes, Duc de Beaufort, but who knows how it's pronounced in French. So he's one of the leaders of the Fronde, or the Frondeurs, as they're called. And he is in prison, and the Musketeers are helping him escape from prison, or at least two of the Musketeers are. One of the interesting things about this book is that they find themselves on the different sides of the conflict. So D'Artagnan and Porthos are on one side, helping the Cardinal track down the Duc de Beaufort, and then Athos and Aramis are on the other side, helping the Duc de Beaufort escape. Now, what was interesting is that the Duc de Beaufort is not portrayed again as a purely good guy. He's presented as vain and ambitious, and in many ways has all the faults of Colonel Mazarin, who he's against. But the Musketeers, or at least a couple of them, realize his symbolic value. So they're helping him to escape, even though they realize he's a really flawed person. And I thought that was interesting. And then there's a good dramatic scene where the four Musketeers realize that they're on different sides, and they have a confrontation, and they have to decide whether their loyalty to each other is more important than the political causes that they've ended up on, the different sides of the political causes during this turbulent time in French history. And that's all quite interesting. And then they go across the English Channel, where the English are also having their own civil war here. And they get involved in that, trying to assist King Charles, who is fighting against the Republicans. Of course, if you know the history, you know that King Charles is going to come to a bad end. But the Musketeers make a heroic effort to save him before he does meet his tragic end. Now, like I said, the French history during this period I know nothing about. The English Civil War I know a little bit about. Most of my knowledge comes from, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, Monarchy by David Starkey, which had some chapters dealing with this period, and the radio drama from This Sceptered Isle, which also had some episodes dealing with this period. So, based on the knowledge I have of the English Civil War, I can see that Alexandre Dumas is portraying a very skewed version of English history, in which King Charles is just an innocent victim. He's just a martyr just because he's so pure, and everybody on the other side is just bloodthirsty and just wants to kill him just because they hate good kings. So, without getting into all the details, that's not really what happened here. King Charles, I think, even if you give a charitable history, was just as much of the cause of this civil war as the other sides. The other thing is Alexandre Dumas skips over the whole Second English Civil War. So in Alexandre Dumas' version, the Scots hand over King Charles to the Parliament, and then Parliament just rushes into immediately putting him on trial and beheading him. In the actual history, Parliament was trying to make an accommodation with him. King Charles kept stalling until the royalist forces were able to regroup. King Charles was able to make an escape, and there was a whole second civil war that broke out, which in the 20 years after version, we just completely pretend didn't happen. And I understand a certain amount of that is not ideology, a certain amount of that is just the pacing of the book, right? We can't get into all the historical details. We have to streamline things somewhat. But it does, and then after the Second English Civil War, King Charles was captured again, and he still refused to come to an accommodation with Parliament. And if you listen to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, he's got a whole season on the English Revolution, also known as the English Civil War, in which he makes the point repeatedly that nobody wanted to kill King Charles. They wanted to come to some sort of accommodation with him, where Parliament would put him in some sort of box where his powers were restricted by Parliament, a constitutional monarchy. But King Charles just kept refusing to compromise with them until they really didn't know what else to do with them, and then they just felt like they had to cut off his head. And one of the episodes on this, on Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, he is looking backwards at the revolutions he's covered and talking about how it was a lot of the obstinacy of the monarchs that forced events. And he's like, yeah, King Charles, man, nobody wanted to kill you. You just refused to compromise until they felt that was their only option left. So yeah, I mean, go listen to Mike Duncan's podcast on the English Revolution to get the full version of this here. But yeah, all of that is completely left out of the Three Musketeers version, or the version here in 20 years after. And I mentioned this in the previous video. I really at a loss to figure out what is going on with Alexandre Dumas's politics. Is he that reactionary conservative? Or is he being ironic here? Or what's going on? I mean, there are a couple ironies. One irony is at one point, the narrator mentions, let me see if I can find this here. Sorry, consulting my notes. The narrator mentions something about, the narrator, so not one of the characters, but the narrator editorialized, says, the Parliament condemned Charles Stuart to death, as it was easy to foresee. Political trials are always empty formalities, for the same passions which bring the accusation pronounce the judgment also. Such is the terrible logic of revolutions. Yeah, but in the previous book, The Three Musketeers, what happened in that book, right? It was the Three Musketeers, or I guess the Four Musketeers, who put Milady on trial, brought all the accusations themselves, and then pronounced their judgment. So, what's going on there? I mean, that's the same thing, right? So why is it okay when they do it and not okay when the Parliament does it? I almost wonder if Dumas is being a little bit deliberately ironic, because the chapter in both books is named The Trial. So the chapter in the original Three Musketeers, in which Milady is condemned to death by the Musketeers, in which they act both as accusers and judges. And then the chapter in 20 years after, when he complains about the same thing happening to King Charles I, is also named The Trial. So is it being deliberately ironic, or is it just an oversight? Or I don't know. The other thing which occurred to me is maybe a little bit of an irony here is... At one point, King Charles is praising the Three Musketeers, because the Three Musketeers keep trying to save him. And of course, it's a doomed effort, because everyone knows historically King Charles has to get his head chopped off. But King Charles makes the point that all his English friends have deserted him, and it's these four Frenchmen who are nobly trying to save him from his own countrymen. And I thought to myself, it's just like the Scarlet Pimpernel in reverse. So in the Scarlet Pimpernel, which was written by a refugee, but I believe published in England, it's a brave Englishman who is going over to France to save Frenchmen from the bloodthirsty French Revolution. And the 20 years after, it's noble Frenchmen who are going over to England to save the English from the bloodthirstiness of the English Revolution. And, both books were published in the 19th century, for whatever that's worth. 20 years after was in the middle 19th century. The Scarlet Pimpernel was at the end of the 19th century, but still. The interesting how the English Revolution and the French Revolution are portrayed in English and French literature, I guess is what you could say. So yeah, it bugged me a little bit, the what appeared to be the reactionary politics of this book. And I talked about it in my previous video as well. The reactionary politics of these books. Excuse me. But when I'm reading these books, I am reading them for the plots, the intrigues, the adventure and the escapes and all this kind of thing. And I try and just, as much as possible, ignore the politics and just enjoy these books for being adventure stories. And they are good swashbuckling stories if you just ignore the politics. Another thing, something I forgot to mention in the previous video, which applies to the Three Musketeers and perhaps applies even more to 20 years after, is all the use of coincidence as a way to advance the plot. So if a character is traveling down the road and he meets somebody by chance, you know it's not going to just be a random person. It's going to be turned out to be a long-lost friend or a long-lost enemy or the son of a long-lost enemy or the son of a long-lost friend. There are all these random connections where everybody is connected to everybody else, and you are always, anybody you encounter is going to be somebody who has some sort of connection with you. Although that connection is often not revealed until several chapters later. And it makes me wonder a little bit if this was just a thing that 19th century novelists did. Because the other 19th century novelist who did this all the time was Charles Dickens. Right? Charles Dickens always relied on characters running into people who were connected to them just on coincidence. I'm not sure if there's some sort of academic thesis out there. There probably is on the use of coincidence in 19th century serialized novels. But whatever. The point is, it's definitely something that's noticeable. To a certain extent, you might want to roll your eyes at it, and there's definitely that temptation. But to another extent, it does increase the pleasure of reading these books, especially because the mystery of who this mysterious stranger that they met on the road is always milked over a couple chapters. And, I guess, again, these novels were originally serialized, so it would have been milked over a few installments, right? So they meet somebody on the road, you're like, okay, I know this is either the son of their enemy or their long-lost friend or somebody's cousin. This character is going to be somebody. And then you just have to kind of wait to see who it turns out to be, and it keeps you turning the pages. So it's interesting in that regard. Right, and I think that is more or less all I have to say about 20 years after. So, next I will come back and talk about the third book in the Three Musketeers series. Stay tuned for that one. Thank you very much, BookTube, and I will talk to you later.